Hello and welcome to Stewarding Family Wealth on Business RadioX. We are broadcasting live from Subaru of Gwinnett Studio. I am your host, Randy Brunson. This series is presented by Centurion Advisory Group, serving individuals and businesses who choose to live on purpose. In the studio with me this afternoon is Sandy Leroux, our lead advisor at Centurion Advisory Group, as well as Stephanie Sandridge, our operations manager. Thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon, and today we're going to be talking about avoiding debt. The concept or idea of avoiding debt, it's not new, it's not unique. Anyone that writes about money or teaches about money always emphasizes the value of having less debt than more debt. You can listen to Dave Ramsey, you can listen to Larry Burkett, Susie Orman, just about any consumer finance columnist will encourage less debt than more debt. There's a simple concept when it comes to debt, and sometimes I express it like this. I personally would rather earn interest than pay interest. And that's in an environment where interest is something less than 1%. You really have to put on your glasses and use a magnifying glass to see the interest credits on your account. But it's still, I'd rather earn it than pay it. So we're just going to share some stories today about what we've seen. Maybe share a couple of ratios, but it's really just going to be around stories. I'll share one ratio with you. We shared this in some writing that we did last year, and we posted it. But many of us, well, I start to say many of us have homes. I would hope that all of us listening have a home or a place to hang our hat, but many of us have mortgages, okay? And there are some of you listening, your home is paid for. That's a phenomenal goal, is to have your home completely paid for, except for the taxes and insurance component, but have that mortgage paid off. But for those of you that happen to have a mortgage, what we've learned over the years in terms of the ratios between available cash flow and mortgage value and home value, mortgage balance and home value, is in a best case scenario, keep your mortgage balance at no more than 2 times your household income. So if there's one income in the household, multiply times 2, and set a goal of having a mortgage balance at no larger than that number. If there's 2 incomes in the household and there's confidence that those 2 incomes will be sustainable long term, then multiply that number times 2 and make sure your mortgage balance is under that. From a home value standpoint, this is a little different assessment, but from a home value standpoint, if you can keep your home's market value at no more than 2.5 to 3 times annual income, those are good ratios. Mortgage balance 2x annual income, home value no more than, let's say, 3x, 2.5 to 3x annual income. The reason for the mortgage at no more than 2 times is it gives you the freedom and flexibility to have discretionary cash flow. You don't have all your dollars absorbed in caring for a mortgage and other house-related expenses. The reason behind the market value, that's a little different, is this. Okay, every home requires maintenance, upkeep, renovation, and repairs to keep it in good working order and to help it maintain its market value. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the more expensive the home, if your home is worth $200,000, then it will probably take $5,000-$6,000 a year across years to maintain it. If it's worth $1 million, it will take probably $30,000 to $40,000 to $50,000 a year. There's a correlation between the value of the home and the amount of money that you need to spend every year to keep that home in good working order and keep up its market value. Okay, and so perhaps you're granted an enormous sleeve of stock options so that you can buy $1 million home, but your base and bonus is $200,000, $250,000. You will end up allocating a significant portion of your available cash flow to maintaining the home. So that's the reason for some of those ratios. But away from those ratios, let's talk about stories. Sandy, talking about debt in general, what stories can you share with us from your life experience? What have you learned about debt? Do you prefer debt? Do you prefer no debt? How have you handled it when you've had debt? Just a story you want to share?
Growing up, just real quick, I was always a big saver. So that was always something I had learned. But later on in life, going through school and stuff, it was a little different. Learned the hard way how credit cards worked and was quick to get out of that and my intention was never to make that mistake again, which was to run up balances and not being able to pay them off every month. And then the interest would accrue more than what you could afford to pay every month. So I learned that at a young age. And so my desire has been and continues to be, if I use a credit card, I use it like I'm paying out of my checking account. I don't charge more than what I can pay for each month. So I track my expenses that way. I don't know necessarily that I would recommend that to everybody, because not everybody, you have to be in the mindset and being intentional, making sure that you pay that off every month. Because if one time you can't, then you get into this downward cycle of not being able to pay it off. And so I wouldn't recommend that unless you know that you can just stay on top of that one. For me, in terms of mortgage, when in another episode we had talked about what had happened, my husband had a serious accident back in 2007, and we had an expensive home and nice cars and whatever. And so when he had his accident, our life changed. We had to shut our business down. Everything I did was taking care of him. So we ended up having to let our house go. It was right when the whole market went. So we were kind of among all the others. Everyone's like, aren't you lucky? Aren't you happy that everybody else is going through it too? And I'm like, no, that doesn't make me feel any better. So the day that we were able to save up and buy another house again was an exciting day. So I take it seriously, the mortgage. I don't like having debt at all, but I understand that I'm investing in a home. So it's a different thing. But like when it comes to a vehicle, yeah, I think cars are beautiful, and isn't it nice to have a new car? What I don't like is that as soon as I drive off the lot, I owe more on the car than what it's worth right after I drove off. So my preference is to buy a used car, preferably save for it. If I'm not in that position, then I'll buy a used one, and I don't like having a car payment more than a couple $100 a month, because I want to be able to manage it and have money for other things. Like I have a grandbaby. I'd rather have my money and go buy her stuff or do stuff with her or my children than to pay on something that, after a while you drive in the car and you like it, but it doesn't have the same excitement it did when you first got it.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So that's so you have to remember that when you go and get into debt for something. So
right.
that's my thinking. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of debt.
I understand completely. And I agree with you, by the way. I like your approach to that. And again, those are simply decisions. Okay, I'd rather spend my money here on the grandbaby than on having a new car every 2 years and the expense, the payments that come with that. If you pay cash for it, which many people do.
Yes.
We know a number of people just from our practice and their position, they pay cash. But still, if you're going to buy a new car every 2 years, you're still coming out of pocket. And in fact, I'll tell you a story about a lady. She drives a 20-year-old Toyota Corolla. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
And she's proud of it.
Yeah, it has a cash value of about $3.50. It gets her where she wants to go, but she has enough in petty cash probably to buy 5 new ones, doesn't she?
Oh, at least, yes.
Yeah. And that's just petty cash. That's not real money, And she makes her quiver with anxiety to think about going to buy a new car, and I have to spend that money. It's just a phenomenal attitude about money, and so that kind of thing. But it works for her. That approach works for her. Solomon, one of the wisest and wealthiest men that ever walked the planet, said that the borrower is servant or slave to the lender. That's true. Said, if you don't have the money to pay, your bed will be snatched out from under you. Yes, you can lose your house, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway, Stephanie, tell us, just share a story with us about your experience with debt.
Have had just a little bit of it. I don't care for it. Similar, I think, I don't know, this might be a little bit common for people in their early 20s, the credit card thing. My family went through that as well. And as soon as we got it paid off, that's it. We don't have credit cards at all, where you're comfortable, managing your expenses with it in a certain way.
Yeah.
I'm not quite that comfortable with it. So we paid off our credit cards and we don't own them. And so if we need to have a large expense, we try to save. I will tell you, though, honestly, home loaning, we did have something come up that we didn't anticipate. We had the cash, but that would have completely depleted our savings. So we went ahead and decided to finance or get a loan for that. But what we did was we paid it off, in half the time. And now I just continued making that payment, even though it's paid off. I've
Right.
continued making that payment in that account to save up for the next thing that might come along. That way I'm not caught off guard and I can have the cash to pay for it instead of having to get a loan. So
Smart.
that's two experiences that I've had. I'm not a fan. It just causes, again, there's a time and a place.
Right.
But sometimes, and I think, for some people, it just causes unnecessary stress and worry and concern and, can be a cause of tension in the household. And I think the sooner people figure out how they're comfortable with it, first of all, like
Right.
how do I relate to it, and get on the same, if you're married, get on the same page with that, then you can come up with a plan for how you're going to choose to engage it in your life.
Good.
I think that's the key. Being on the same page, I think, is very important.
It is. It really is. And that takes, well, I've been married for several years. And you continue to study how that works, don't you?
Yes. Yes.
And, at this point, Tricia and I are just thrilled to be together, thrilled to be healthy and living and together. And I'm very, very grateful. But it does take continual focus on understanding and loving and learning. And I've learned to trust her heart. I trust her heart completely. So, that's so valuable. The one story, I'll take a couple of minutes here and share a story. It's just one of these stories I remember from years ago, but it was so instructive about debt. And again, the story comes from my grandfather, the one that I've referenced in other episodes, and his name is Cliff Adams. And the story itself goes back to the 60s. I was probably in the mid-60s. I was 19 or 11, something like that. And my grandparents had this, it's called a plat map, P-L-A-T-T. And a plat map, it was Rogers County, Oklahoma, which is where my grandfather was born and I was born and my mother was born. Mostly rural. It's the county east of Tulsa. And the plat map had the sections of land laid out in the county. So it was like a pen and paper drawing of the section. Now, for those of you not familiar with the Great Plains, a section of land is 1 mile square and it's 640 acres. So, and often you drive across the Midwest, if it's wheat land, it'll be open. If it's cattle land, it'll be under a barbed wire fence. And so a section of land is 1 mile square. A quarter of a section is 160 acres. Okay? And so this plat map had the entire county laid out in quarter section lots. So if somebody owned as little as a quarter of a section, it had their name written in there. Okay? And by the way, Rogers County is named for Will Rogers' dad. That's too much information, but just random trivia. And if you don't know Will Rogers, look him up. Okay,
Yeah.
It's very quotable. One of Will Rogers' quotes that I like the most. He said that he was not a humorist; that all he did was watch Congress and report the facts. So, yeah. But Grandpa had this plat map of the county, and in the lower half of the plat map, okay, there was section after section after section after section that had the McFarland name on it. The family's last name was McFarland, okay? And there must have been, 15 or 20 or 30 sections with the McFarland name on there.
Wow.
That's thousands of acres of land. It was pasture, okay? And then just south of the McFarland land, there was the Deems, D-I-E-M. It was some folks that, generations before had come from Germany and settled, and they also owned 20 or 30 or 40 sections, okay? And I knew that the families were cattle ranchers. Grandpa and I talked about it, and, I knew some of the McFarlands. I didn't know any of the Deems, but I knew some of the McFarlands. But the families had big cattle operations, okay? Just thousands and thousands of acres, hundreds and thousands of head of beef cattle. And so I said to Grandpa, how did the Deems and the McFarlands end up with this much property? So he told me a story. He said that during World War I, the price of beef was going up. First takeaway is war is generally good for the economy because the government's spending money. But the price of beef was going up during World War I because the Army was buying a lot of beef to ship overseas to feed the soldiers, converting it to a transportable form and that kind of thing. And so the price of beef was going up. And he said that many of the local ranchers, what they would do is they would buy additional land to raise more cattle, but they would finance that land by borrowing from the bank. So they'd borrow money, buy land, expand their cattle herds, and sell for higher and higher prices. And he said then the war came to an end, and the price of beef went down. And the local ranchers that had debt financed their land couldn't make their payments to the bank. And so they needed to sell or the bank was going to take their land. And Grandpa said there were 2 families in the county that did not borrow money to buy land. What they did is they raised cattle, they sold cattle, and they saved their money. Mm-hmm. That was the Deems and the McFarlands. And so when all of the other ranchers needed to sell their land or let it go back to the bank, when the other ranchers needed to sell, the Deems and the McFarlands were buying. So it doesn't matter if it's cattle ranches, if it's pasture land, if it's residential real estate, if it's businesses, if it's stocks, it doesn't matter what you're buying. The absolute best financial position to place yourself in is to be extremely careful, minimize your debt load, always have a huge cash reserve, because opportunity abounds. Opportunity is everywhere. Mm-hmm. As messy as some of the communist countries are, and communism is not America's friend, but as messy as some of the communist countries are, let's take Russia for an example. Russia has still generated a number of multi-billionaires. How? I don't know. That may be like laws and sausages. We just don't need to know how they're made. Yeah. Okay? But the point is, opportunity is everywhere. So opportunity is always around us. Okay? Opportunity is always around us. And the way you capitalize on opportunity is by continuing to learn, by having a small group of trusted advisors. Going back to Solomon, he said there's both wisdom and safety and an abundance of advisors. So have a group of advisors that you go to for counsel, input, advice. How does this work? Is this a good idea for me at this point in my life? You know, some of those kind of things. Mm-hmm. Always have cash, and when opportunity presents itself, when others need to sell, that creates buying opportunities so that we can relieve them of whatever the circumstances are that are creating this need to sell, and it allows us to pick up an asset at a meaningful price that can serve us and our families well. So that's a story for the day. Sandy, any final comments?
Mine is just be careful with debt. I just, minimize it. I'm with you.
Steph, what about you?
I agree.
Well, good. Steph and Sandy, thank you both for joining us on today's episode of Stewarding Family Wealth. Keep in mind, friends, we do appreciate you joining us for this episode of Stewarding Family Wealth, presented by Centurion Advisory Group, where we bring our purpose, perspective, and processes to bear. Those of you who are families who want to build wealth, transfer your assets and values across generations, learn to give generously, reduce your tax bill, and find ways to invest it aligned with your values. You can visit Centurion AG to learn more, and don't forget that you can enjoy these episodes anytime on Business RadioX. Select the Gwinnett Studio and then click on Stewarding Family Wealth, and you can also find them at iTunes, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.